opening up the joke, so this was like the commercial for the joke.
No pressure.
So anyway, hope you're all excited for this joke that's coming up, because it really sets the stage for the rest of the presentation.
Oh!
Oh, I get it. Yeah, all right. Good, someone got it.
That's a lag.
That's the dyslexia. Just click
See, now I'm gonna have trouble competing with you on stage. So,
You only get to do it for 1 minute.
that'd be really boring, because so far he's kind of entertained. All right, next, bad joke of the day. Why did the marketer break up with their boyfriend?
Why?
Lack of engagement.
Oh!
That is thanks to Hannibal Brooks, the inside associate at Olson Zaltman.
Okay, so I get started now. Awesome. All right, so guys, I know we opened with some jokes, but this is going to be a serious presentation. All right, so as I'm talking to you right now, we're moving forward in time, and the products of tomorrow are being created. The self-driving cars, AI chatbots, genetic test kits, they're all here, and companies are making these products with the hope that people will buy them. In order to make sure that marketing and market research accomplish the goals we're aiming for, it's important we understand what factors drive the adoption of cutting-edge products. And for that, we're going to travel to the past. So join me on a journey back in time. Before we get started, there's an important fact to acknowledge. People do like new things. The Nobel Prize-winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman posits that we process experiences through 3 distinct psychological impulses: anticipation, experience, and memory. Anticipation is the excitement built around an imagined future experience, and it's highest in the case of familiar things like going to a restaurant, getting your favorite meal. High anticipation, high experience, because those neural pathways for pleasure are already primed. However, new memories won't necessarily be formed because those distinct consumption occasions will start to blur together. New products exist at the nexus between experience and memory. So in this case, new memories can be formed. And from those memories, new habits that can prove profitable or be engineered for social good. But there's a caveat to all this. People naturally avoid risk. So leading sociologists in the 80s, Beck and Giddens, developed what's called the risk society hypothesis. And what it shows is that risk is unevenly targeted in our society. So especially while it can be associated with any product, it's especially high for things that are complex or harness volatile forces. So all of this begs the question, how was anyone convinced of certain risky things? I mean, this instinct is often wrong, right? How many of you are more scared of roller coasters than sinks? I'm sure every hand would be raised. Yeah. But anyway, sinks kill about 25 times more people than roller coasters. Important thing to know. So how was anyone ever convinced that flying was safe? I mean, I flew to get here. It seems like most of you survived the journey. Yeah, okay. And 8 million people are flying per day. But the average flight is 30,000 feet in the air. The average plane engine has a force of 28 Formula One cars, and it's built of over 1.2 million parts. So it's what we know about risk. How did the marketers of the past solve this problem? I'd like to take you back to the 1930s, when commercial air travel was just leaving the runway. So in the 1930s, air travel was starting to grow, but in order to achieve the economies of scale that needed to be successful, we couldn't have a lot of people be afraid of the product, right? The problem was there was a disconnect between marketers and their customers. People were fascinated by flight, but they viewed it as a risky, barnstorming adventure, and there was a fixation on major crashes and accidents. Meanwhile, marketers wanted to sell the idea of uncomplicated leisure and business travel. So eventually, a team of marketers from across several airlines combined to help the industry as a whole. Here's what they found. First, they couldn't change customer expectations, but they could subvert them using empathy. So if you look at these ads here, you'll see no one looks scared, right? There's cheery businessmen, there's playful kids, there's relaxed families, and that's not without reason. So a 2011 research paper, Perception and Emotion, the Role of Effective Information, found that people viewing a frightened face versus a neutral one were substantially more able to distinguish between contrast levels of the same color. They were also better able to identify subtle environmental cues. So ultimately, the emotions we feel affect what we actually see. So critically, these marketers also determine certain context cues that would be off limits. So if you look at any of these airline ads from the 30s through the 60s, you won't see any images of bodies of water, nighttime flying, mountains, or especially airplane maintenance. So anything suggesting that the product is unsafe. As much as they'd like to scream, this product is crash-proof, they couldn't do that either, but they found a way to address it by simplifying. So if you see these ads on the right here, they presented simplified diagrams of the plane that highlighted its safety features. Now, you may wonder, well, look at these complex schematics. What about what you said about risk, right? Isn't complexity bad? And you would be right? We've all seen these drug ads with, a gigantic list of side effects and felt like this thing isn't safe for you. Well, you would be right, aside from some 2017 research in a paper entitled The Role of Information in the Adoption of Cutting-Edge Products. What researchers found is more information is worse when both an underlying technology and an interface are new, but not when just an interface is new. So if you think about something like the iPhone 7 and the iPhone 8, similar underlying technology, new interface. So you can get as much information across as you want without adding to risk. So what airlines did was leverage the power of metaphor. So they compared the airlines here, you see like a mainliner, they compared it to ships, cars, trains, familiar modes of transport. And this let them communicate more information without adding to the risk. So with these things in place, they started to move forward. They still had a major demographic problem, women. So market research at the time found that 2/3 of people that prevented others from flying were women. And this is because they were concerned about the safety of their spouses and their children. They were actually known in Madison Avenue as airline enemy number one, which is a little, obviously shows the time, 1930s. So ultimately marketers realized they needed to bring these new customers into the fold. So they created programs that allowed women to travel with their husbands on business flights for free, so they could experience the comfort and safety of air travel for themselves. They also released ads that show the tangential benefits of flying, like faster family trips and greater economic benefits at home that would come from a more productive workday. So with these in place, they were able to hugely change the equation. And it's good that they used word of mouth, because they spread word of mouth among women, and ultimately word of mouth was shown to be one of the most effective ways to market riskier complex products. So women went from being 5% of airplane travelers to 30% within just 2 years of this program rolling out. Next, I'd like to take you back to the turn of the century for a technology we're all familiar with, the telephone. But it was a little different back then. So if you can put yourself in the frame of mind of someone in the early 1900s, the telephone would have been a pretty crazy device, right? You were able to hear a disembodied voice talking to you in real time, so it seemed almost magical. But there was a problem to that magic. It left a lot of room for misinterpretation. So at the turn of the century, there was a lot of interest in the occult and technology where they interacted. So this actually led to a number of preachers calling the telephone an instrument of the devil, as well as a best-selling book at the time called Are the Dead Alive? It suggested that spirits inhabited the world around us. They could talk to you through telephones, they could take possession of your body, and so this led to a number of early telephone lines being sabotaged and destroyed. Meanwhile, this doesn't end the problems the telephone faced. There were also practical concerns about the technology. So you've all probably been on a call and heard that crickling and crackling, like when you're waiting on a call. There was worries that continual exposure to that by holding the receiver to your ear would cause you to go deaf. So again, more telephones being smashed and destroyed. And finally, the verdict's still on the smartphone on this. Telephones were seen as a menace to public manners. So yeah, this is a headline from the 1907 New York Times that worried the telephone was destroying the social fabric of society. So jury's still out on that. So anyway, marketers for the telephone had a lot of problems to overcome. And so I looked at a 2017 research paper on factors that prevent consumers from adopting innovative products, and found a couple of frameworks that were useful for marketers back then. So the first was relative advantage, and that's how much of an improvement a product is over existing offerings. So at the time of the telephone, its competitor was the telegram, which would convey about 10.33 words per message on average. Meanwhile, the telephone could get across 100 to 120 words per minute. So telephone marketers realized huge advantage if we can emphasize that. The second is perceived risk. And so that's how much is at stake when you're switching from one product to another. So if you think about something like online ticketing and online banking, use similar technology for the transaction itself, but much more is at stake if you're thinking, I'm gonna miss the front row seat at Metallica versus my life savings, right? So in the case of the telephone, if you're worried about going deaf, occult possession, the breakdown of society, obviously some major perceived risk marketers had to deal with. So telecom companies solved this problem by simplifying. In a manner similar to what airlines would use 20 years down the road, they presented simplified diagrams that illustrated the advantages of the telephone for commerce, for politics, and for innovation. And so ultimately, when people were less worried about being possessed, losing their hearing, the breakdown of society, they were far more likely to adopt the product. They also combated this public incivility argument head on by leveraging the power of metaphor. So if you look at this ad here, they describes the telephone or party line, which most early phone lines were, like a barn raising, which at the time was a highly symbolic and communal act many people had participated in. They also emphasized it as a tool to connect with distant relatives. So by using metaphor, they were able to ultimately turn the page on telephone usage. So after these ads were deployed, it was hugely effective. Telephones went from being in 16% of households to 42% within 10 years. And telephone calls outnumbered telegraph messages by 5 to 1 within just 3 years. Finally, I'd like to take you back to the early 1800s for a technology arguably created by nature itself, ice. But nature sometimes needs help in a marketing environment. So in the early 1800s, ice was primarily used by farmers in the northeastern United States when they were transporting butter to markets to keep it from melting. But it didn't have much culinary usage. But a young New Englander named Frederick Tudor saw enormous potential in this product after a faithful trip to the Caribbean. You know, people there are hot, they could benefit from ice. Pretty simple logic. So he came back home and innovated a way to keep ice from melting for months to years, using the insulating power of sawdust. So once he had this idea, he gathered some investors, he loaded up a ship with 130 tons of ice and set sail for the tropics to make a fortune. Now, the trip of 130 tons of ice to the Caribbean in the 1800s, it failed, but not for the reasons you think. So the ice didn't melt on the way there. The problem was, once he got there, people had no idea how to use the product. So people would buy ice, wrap it up in blankets, take it home, and wonder why it didn't melt. People there had never seen ice. And ultimately, this led to it being a disaster. Tudor went bankrupt, he ended up in debtor's prison. But while he was there, he was convinced the idea was still sound, he just needed a new way to market it. So when he got out, he tried a new approach. He crisscrossed the southern United States and the Caribbean, and he would travel to bars with ice. He would have them offer their standard menu of drinks and give customers the option of choosing to have it with or without ice. And of course, once they tried to drink with ice, there was no going back. He also held clinics for doctors where he showed them the usage of ice for treating feverish patients, and he held workshops for restaurants and hotels in which he would teach them how to make ice cream for their customers. So ice sales started to skyrocket. What changed? What Tudor had effectively done was gamify the ice experience. Now, 2019 research into gamification is no laughing matter. So, right, I had to get a couple of cheap jokes there. So, the research in gamification found that it boosts product adoption through playfulness and curiosity. So, playfulness is when customers in a playful state of mind, they're more willing to explore all the attributes of a product. It makes them more tangible, and it makes relative advantage more clear. Curiosity means while they're in that playful state of mind, they're also more willing to think about new applications for the product. So by doing these things, Tudor ultimately ended a success. He died a 100 millionaire known as the Ice King. In the 1860s, the only product the U.S. shipped more of per year than ice was cotton, and just barely. And in 1862, the book that was seminal to American bar culture, The Bartender's Guide, was published. And of course, nearly all of its recipes included ice. So how can you make sure that your product lasts the test of time? There's a couple of key takeaways from this presentation. Highlighting the relative advantage of your product is important. Demonstrating social proof, simplifying the concept, gamifying the experience, and reducing the risk for your consumers. Because if they think the product is going to hurt them, obviously they're not going to use it. And so the company I work for, Olson Zaltman, I know you said don't touch the podium, but I'm going to do it here. We found the most effective way for examining these factors, and like I mentioned with the airplane, all the subtle cues that lead to this is by using the power of metaphor. Because through metaphors, people show what matters to them, what scares them, what the subtle factors are that determine the way they experience life. And we use this from everything to designing funeral services, CPGs, pharma, etc. So ultimately, when you're thinking about your product, your brands, your marketing experience, what do you want us to be talking about in 100 years? And I'll leave you with that thought. Thank you.
Wow.
Woohoo!
We have like a whole 37 seconds. There are no questions submitted on Visibo, but the sound here is great.
Well, besides being afraid of my phone now, what's your perspective, given this kind of context, for self-driving cars?
Right. Okay, good. 37 seconds, right? Or I guess 37 seconds to count down. Okay, so I would say for self-driving cars, I actually had a great conversation with, where is he in the room? Right here, this guy back here. So we were talking about this. A lot of what happens is people don't understand the tangential benefits of a self-driving car, right? So your car, when you're at work or whatever, it can be driving, picking up passengers, doing all these other things. So I think as far as these factors are concerned, simplifying is definitely going to be key because people are afraid of complexity. So simplifying, maybe finding a fun way to introduce them to it. That research I mentioned about gamification earlier was actually about shoes online, a product at least Nike was doing, and they created a video game. So maybe start with small steps and work their way forward. I think that's all I have. Yeah.